Hi, and welcome to History Mostly Ancient Discussions. My name is Richard. I have my co-presenters, Aaron and Greg, who are going to discuss the Ukraine conflict as it has moved over the past month. And of course, we would love to credit all of the sources for our visuals. You can see them here, as well as our statistics. It's really incredible that both YouTube sources and like Kings and Generals or groups that are modern news agencies like France 24 and Axios are providing this kind of information that we can then use to have a more detailed high-level analysis of what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about the Wagner situation.
Yeah. So what I did is I had my old presentation, not my old one, from a month ago, and I was going to continue for where we left off. But clearly, since June 24th, or since we are aware of it as of June 24th, with the Wagner Group open rebellion, which is really how I term this. I don't term this as a sort of coup d'etat, as you were pointing out earlier, this sense of sort of a full-scale overthrow, et cetera, because I just don't think the facts sort of pan that out. I figured that I would sort of emphasize this presentation as that timetable. We can then go into other areas. Hopefully, Greg and you are comfortable with this, primarily because I think that's just what's on everyone's mind right now, versus the triggering of 2 battalions and 1 company over here and there, which is, I think, a continuation of the world's slowest counteroffensive since the last world's slowest counteroffensive. So, I think in the next few weeks or month, we'll be able to fully update June and July and the slow counteroffensive in Ukraine. So that was my focus on the presentation today.
I could give my understanding of why this all happened, and if it's okay for me to
absolutely.
say,
Do you mind going to the next slide? Because I do have a few kind of visuals here that I think might be helpful, or not helpful, just funny, but helpful.
I do listen to a lot of Russian and Ukrainian sources and hear the opinion of various analysts, and I formed my view. I mean, maybe it's nothing original. I think the main thing is that Prigozhin, he became very too powerful for his own good, and he is probably was intoxicated with this power, because he had a real power. It's unprecedented, this kind of private army, and they're one of the most effective units in Russian army. And he wanted special treatment, and then he got into conflict with Shoigu and Gerasimov. Shoigu is a minister of defense. Shoigu is also very close to Putin, also very, very powerful. He has the whole clan, and I think Putin was he kind of played them against each other, but it just went when he went public with all kinds of media, Prigozhin, and actually achieved a lot of popularity as a result of it. He became very dangerous, and Putin had to make a choice. And he chose Shoigu for obvious reasons. I mean, Shoigu is not just one man; it's the whole clan. He is a very popular, very powerful, and he has the army. I mean, army it's still a much bigger thing. So when Shoigu decided to push that kind of decision to enroll, to force Wagner, personnel to sign contracts direct with an army, and that would de facto take the whole power away from Prigozhin. He was like a dead man if that would have happened, because he would have nothing. He would have no army, so he had nothing to lose, because he realized that once Putin went along with this, he kind of threw him under the bus. So he had to play something. So he used his trump card, is this revolt, in order to negotiate better terms which he did. I think it's all happened for that reason. That was his purpose. And he did negotiate the terms. He explained what he's got. He explained his options. He managed to talk because Putin didn't want to talk to him, I understand, at all. And he also thought that maybe Putin would stand on his side, maybe he will intervene. But once he called him a traitor, and so he knew there was no choice. And basically he did achieve something, because he was at the dead end, because the rebellion started 1 week before the deadline of when they had to sign. Because if they don't sign it, they would be outlawed, all of the soldiers, all of the officers. So he had to do something because he was already losing, and he kind of achieved that. He got a better term, and he kind of retained some power. He's still alive, otherwise he wouldn't be. That's how I see it.
Now,
Yeah, no, I think
wait. I want to push back on a few things. I want to sort of understand. The Wagner Group has been Russia's most successful arm, if you want to call it, of its military struggle against Ukraine, right? The Russian army, Kadyrov's forces, Wagner, of them, Wagner seems to be the most successful. Why would Putin want to compromise that, especially as the war is not going as well as he thought?
Because he lost control. He felt that he lost control of Prigozhin, because Prigozhin got intoxicated with power. He started this quarrel with army. He just started to act independently. He went into the media on his own without Putin's permission or approval. Putin realized that he became out of control. He thought he is powerful enough to call the shots, Prigozhin, and at that point, Putin realized that he had to, lose him, sacrifice him.
Yeah, I do think there is a a structural or systemic fundamental challenge and mismanagement within the Russian Ministry of Defense and the national security state. Because if you look at how Russia sort of configured itself in national security and defense terms, prior to the full-blown invasion of Ukraine versus we'll call it the shadow invasion that happened since 2014, and their small sort of contract military engagements they would have across the Middle East and in Central Asia. That Putin and the regime, more importantly, because it's easy to sort of over instrumentalize as like Putin has this array of buttons, like Dexter's laboratory, and he's just pushing buttons and things are happening. I mean, there's a whole infrastructure of hundreds and thousands really of sort of key people underneath Putin that is in the regime that actually implement all these policies or the shifts in these policies. Russia was really configured as a protectorate, as a patrilineal sort of structure to keep power centralized in the Kremlin and never allow sources of power to gain too much mass, too much density. So you would have parts of the military, all of its military districts that would have, some of them would be starved of resources, people, or material, or training. Some of it would be mixed around, so it would be constant shifting, so that you would rarely build this sort of power base. And then you would contract out, so you wouldn't have to publicize your losses if you had them in Ukraine or Syria or anywhere else, to third-party private military contractors. And that was an effective strategy, as effective as these things can be for an authoritarian state, up until this mass-scale invasion. Now, once the mass-scale invasion happened, the Russians really didn't reorganize themselves around a large-scale land war, which even during this kind of rebellion period, they didn't reorganize after a year and a half of that almost. And that is sort of the surprising thing, because at a certain point, it just would have been logical to bring in all your different area and army group commanders and all your private military contractors, all your defense apparatus, and really sort of reset. And they never did that. Now they're going to do that now. That's obvious. I mean, because you can't, I mean, just not from an intelligence perspective, they're going to have to embed the GRU everywhere now. This goes back to the old school playbook. This goes back to the, 40s, 50s, and really the 40s and 50s. Where
Wait, I just want to take a second on that. They're going to embed the GRU throughout the military. What would be the advantage of that? Because isn't the GRU's functional ability that they're able to collect information and data and use propaganda? Isn't it not like to put them in the military would seem an ineffective use of their talents?
So what's going to happen, and you're totally right. Like you could argue they had a TV show CIA version of the GRU running the last 15, 20 years, where they're running all these sort of real world version of silly TV show clandestine operations, poisoning people and, trying to do little coups and supporting bad guy here and there, which I think people overestimate the capability of intelligence agencies to do that anywhere in the world, except for sort of the GRU, or at least the GRU has a whole bunch of actors willing to take sort of ridiculous risks, and they do it long enough, they get pretty good at it, or good enough at it, as good as you could probably get. And that became what the GRU, like if you went to the University of the GRU, that's basically what it was up until now. But now, because of what happened with Wagner Group, it was already happening, where
Wagner is part of GRU.
Exactly. And so when you lose control of something of this magnitude, right? And we have to look at what happened to Wagner, right? And I have some slides that go into that, but the normal Wagner pre this conflict was always somewhere between 3, 4, and maybe 10,000 people. But because of this conflict, they were able to raid the prisons. And so they grew pretty substantially to 30, 40, 50, maybe 60,000 even. So they wound up getting all that mass that under normal circumstances, in a protectorate regime like Russia has, you would just not allow somebody or some group of somebodies to gain that much mass, but also that much capability on the battlefield too, right? And resources, right? Military hardware, et cetera. So once they decide to, let's say, break up Wagner or reduce how Wagner exists and the other PMCs, because there's 30, 50 more of these, they're going to be taken over by the Ministry of Defense. It's obvious. And that's what you have to do. And then you're going to turn the GRU and the SVR, the domestic spy capability, their version of the FBI that's a lot scarier, and they're going to embed these people in as really modern day political commissars, or KGB commissars, into everywhere there's a command, very much like the Chinese do. The Chinese have a system in the PLA that, in their case, goes all the way down to the fire team and the squad. I mean, it's that inefficient, which is a different story for a different day. But the Russians are going to have to. They won't probably get that efficient, because that's too much information to have to centralize and manage. But they're going to, at least down to that battalion and company level, I would expect to see GRU and SVR, we'll call them political information, spy commissars, are going to get embedded, so that at any point ever, they're never going to fire up something like this rebellion again, because they're not going to just go back to business as usual, May 29th, like this didn't happen. There's no way that's happening. And this has a huge cost for the Russians, because they're going to have to reset. And these type of resets take a very long time. I mean, it isn't like you have off the shelf at a Costco a whole bunch of, SVR and GRU people who know how to do this, right? You got to pull out of the archives all these playbooks on how to do this effectively, how to build systems, especially in the modern world. You have phones, right? You have, different communications methods. I mean, you're going to have to collect information. In a lot of ways, the Russians don't have anywhere near the surveillance state that the Chinese have, I mean, it's probably 5%. They're going to have to increase that, at least when it comes to the military and intelligence and anyone that could be a legitimate threat. They're going to have to increase that pretty dramatically. And where this gets real mechanical is like, if you're in the Chinese PLA, like you don't have your own phone, like
Yeah,
you have their phone, and it has all their apps on it. And I'm sure you can have some other stuff to buy, you know, stuff on Baidu or whatever, but it's like, it's still their issue, right? And so, and that's all massive collection infrastructure.
Yeah, I want to sort of underline this point that you're making, which is that China and Russia throughout the last 40 to 50 years took two fundamentally different structures. Sorry, the last 40 years have taken two fundamentally different structures in terms of how they were going to monitor the post-communist period in Russia and the corresponding opening period under Deng Xiaoping, which is that in China, there was always going to be monitoring. There was always going to be an organized surveillance state over the population. And so that incrementally developed as the technology increased, as the internet became more common, and so on and so forth.
Especially
in Russia, the position was that,
especially post-Tiananmen.
Yeah. In Russia, the position was that they were going to be open and not control the information that people have, actually create numerous different sources of information so that people would be politically disengaged.
That's
because
right.
They would know what was accurate and what was true. And so you wouldn't need to monitor the population. And so the situation that Russia finds itself in now is that they need a population that is politically engaged and politically loyal, so that way they go fight in the war. And
That's
so
right.
you have this mismatch of situations where you haven't built the surveillance state to monitor the people and direct their interest in accordance with that new aim of patriotism and loyalty.
That's right. And if you go a couple slides, because I have I kind of cover.
Why do you think they want people politically engaged in Russia? I kind of thought that they don't want that.
So they're patriotic and politically engaged in that they're supporting the war, as opposed to not having an opinion. Because if they don't have an opinion and a draft order comes, they're going to leave.
Yeah, I mean, one issue structurally.
That's what's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
If you go ahead a couple more slides, and then we'll come back to some of these slides to get into it. A few more. Sorry. Keep going. A little more. Like another. There we go, right there. Oh, back up.
Wait, this one or ISW?
Yeah. No, back up one.
Okay.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, so I kind of tried to put this sort of complete end to end as much as I could sort of synthesize to sort of build on your point, Richard. I think one of the fundamental challenges is that what Prigozhin and the Wagnerites on Telegram have effectively done is they've delegitimized the army leadership completely as somewhere between incompetent, incapable, corrupt, mismanaged, etc. And they could use the sources of the conflict, soldiers not being paid, sort of a cannon fodderness of it all, mismatch between, weapons and equipment all over the place, which of course, the expectation using sort of the great patriotic war and the Cold War, that the Russians, if there was one thing the expectation is in Russian society, is that they could definitely build conventional land warfare platforms, and they have a ton of them. And the fact that that after 18 months, the Russian leadership could not muster this. And then, of course, you have the failed sort of initial invasion phase. And so, Prigozhin almost built this sort of social media, Kardashian gangster kind of mode of being able to talk smack basically back. And that has given him enormous equity, especially amongst younger populations, let's say these sub 35-year-old populations, 40-year-old populations, which are fundamental to fighting this type of conflict. And that's a big deal in delegitimizing the army. And I think up until this rebellion, they were very careful to sort of segregate the the commentary they had about the incompetence or almost criminality of the army leadership and Putin himself or the Kremlin regime, almost in a way of saying, they're pulling the wool over your eyes. They're not giving you the real briefing. It's not your fault. It's their fault, etc. And that I think has been fairly effective. In the last 6 months to a year, really, because the Wagner group, because don't just look at what Prigozhin does online. It's many of his sub-commanders, right? They have their channels, which I'm sure Greg reads some of those, and or other people forward those, and they're out there saying their thing, which many times is more radical than whatever Prigozhin says. He's actually seems to be calmer head versus some of them, because they're much more in the thick of it. So I think that dynamic really kicked off last summer, or last spring, or last summer, last year, when all the initial failures of the invasion campaign were exposed, and the Russians had to kind of swing into that. If you remember that 4 or 5 months of just mass artillery, which the Wagner people really said was going to be sort of irrelevant. They weren't maybe 100% right in that, but I think they were a little more right than wrong. And that they said, you have to go and take these territory. You have to go and jump into these fights with like a place like Bakhmut is an example of that. And if we're very honest, that's the place that the Wagner spent the last year or so fighting, and mostly eliminating probably a third of their force or more, maybe a half of it. And that is where they, I think, truly built their legitimacy, is that they were actually doing the sacrifice, and many of the other Russian units looked more incompetent outside of the mass artillery. So the fact that the Russians couldn't get an air force up and running and to defeat, and that's something I'm sure the Russian people really struggle with to some degree. Saying, how do we have a Russian Air Force that's the third or fourth or fifth, whatever it's supposed to be, and we can't actually, defeat what the Ukrainian Air Force is, the 30th, 50th, whatever. And so, I mean, there's practical reasons behind that, but I don't think most people sit around and care about the difference in MadPad generations. And so there's this massive cognitive dissonance or disconnect, which I think Wagner, Prigozhin, and many of those people took advantage of, especially in social media. And that, I think, fostered this sense of legitimacy he has. And I think he effectively delegitimized the army leadership. And I mean, ultimately they did just through their incompetence, but he amplified that, I think, publicly. And I think Putin sort of ignored it, is all he did. Up until the open rebellion.
He ignored it for a while,
Yep.
But the thing is that they have a law right now that you cannot criticize the army. You go to jail for, let's just say one. And regular citizens did, while Prigozhin openly criticized the army. He should be in jail like 1,000 times already.
That's right.
And Putin kept him kind of safe for a while, but it appealed to a lot of people because he expressed many sentiments that a lot of people thought, and of course about corruption of the army, and that's all true. But eventually he just again, he got intoxicated because it seems like there's no punishment. He can say whatever he wants.
Right.
He just went completely, and it had to be stopped. And he realized that he becomes completely unmanageable.
That's right.
But eventually, he was losing his all his trump cards. If he would lose his army, like all his teeth would be out. So he improved his situation by creating another trump card.
No, absolutely. I mean, the way I do look at this is that there is when you're dealing with a mercenary environment, which, by the way, is not new. I mean, you could argue this modern state monopoly on violence and having large scale effective armies is really just, in the last 200 to 300 years. prior to that, the norm for a very long time, or the consistent norm for most of our recorded history, was having these sort of, mercenaries versus, knights or masters and mercenaries sort of relationships, which are always, in essence, contract issues. It's the state or the sovereign versus the business. And these are free agents. And the big issue is contract enforcement, which, Richard, I'm sure as a lawyer, you understand what I mean by this, and you understand sort of the critical dimension of what that really means. It's a business deal.
Especially if the entity that you're trying to enforce a contract against has the ability to resist enforcement.
That's right. And I think one of the challenges fundamentally that the Russian army has had objectively is that if you look at their most capable units that could actually directly take on the Wagner and the group itself, which, by the way, is not just a group of 20,000 people sitting in a Glastonbury party for a whole weekend. I mean, these are highly dispersed, especially now, in very, very small units at this point. Probably less than 20 to 50. So you have literally hundreds to maybe up to 1,000 of them spread out. Is that the only units capable of this are the top special operations units that the Russians have, Alpha, which is their, basically Delta Force, which are typically hyper focused on GRU type activities, or on, anti-terrorism, counterterrorism, or in security at the regime level. And they don't have thousands or tens of thousands. No one in the world has units of that size doing that specialization, primarily because it takes decades to become that specialized.
If we could just take a second, one of the comments asked us to introduce ourselves, so I think that might be a little helpful.
Go ahead with your introduction. I'm sorry.
Hi.
See, this is your normal routine. We got disrupted today.
Hi. So I'm Richard. I am an inquisitive nobody who happens to be a lawyer and the person who runs our Middle Eastern history series. This part of the world is a little less well known to me, and so I'm relying on our two effective lay scholars. Aaron de los Reyes served in the U.S. military for over a decade, has a lot of key insight and experience on military tactics and organization. He also is very read up on the internal structure of the Russian government and the various entities and sub-entities in the military, and that's why he's giving his experience there. And Greg is Russian born. He left the country about 40 years ago, but he still maintains ties with a lot of friends and accomplices who live on the Russian side of the border. And so he has a particular cultural insight and an understanding of the propaganda elements and the communication elements that are still going on inside of Russia. And so both of these individuals bring those unique insights to our discussion today.
And I would also add that Greg has a phenomenal background in studying Roman, imperial, and I'd say modern imperial history also. That's my personal take. Greg, I think that's one of the things that you bring.
Now, I have three questions actually that are sort of in the comments and one of my own. So the first question that I have is, one of the elements that was sort of alluded to on the news, but it's not really talked about very often, is that a lot of Prigozhin supporters also tend to be ethno-Russian nationalists. And so there are comments about Shoigu being Tuvan because he is half ethnic Tuvan. But in Russian society, they're supposed to be post-racial, post-ethnic, post these kinds of divides where everybody is a Russian national. Can you sort of comment on the ethno-national dimension, if there is one, of Prigozhin's uprising and sort of the implications in wider Russian society that are changing and developing around this sense of Russian identity as an ethnic group and Russian identity as a national citizenship, because only 80% of Russian citizens are ethnic Russians.
I think for a small or a medium to small minority of Russians, just like people all over the world who have a very ethno-nationalist perspective on where they are. This matters, or let's put it this way: this is the lens that they process most things through, regardless of what the thing is. It could be going to a restaurant, it could be the war in Ukraine, it could be, et cetera, or anything else. And that's not limited to Russia. You see that in other countries. I think the Russians maybe have more of those people than other countries do at this point. Most countries, I mean, I'd say China has more than anybody, but because of the Hanification of China. But I would say that's an issue, but it's not, I think, the dominant issue. I think oh, go ahead, Greg, please.
I'd like to add to it. Well, first of all, there is the word Russian in Russian language. There are two words that somehow comprised only into one in English. One is called Ruski, which is just the ethnic denomination. The other one called Россиянин, the Russia in Russian called Россия. So Россиянин meaning a citizen of a Russian state. So and this is the difference. So there's an ethnic Russians, and so yeah, even though the Russian ethnically Russians are probably maybe 80% of Russian state, yeah, there is plenty of tension, ethnic tensions within Russia. In case of Shoigu, he's kind of accepted. His Tuvan background didn't play much role. He's been there for a long time, but certainly the Russian nationalism is for ethnic Russians, not for the rest of the minorities. There is definitely a big difference. I mean, especially a lot of people discriminated. So people from Middle Asia. I'm talking about all those Asian, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. A lot of those people come to Russia for work and become Russian citizens. I mean, they have an accent. They usually look different. They are discriminated, looked down upon. People from Caucasus that are also distinctly different. They're looking down. I mean, there are all kinds of anecdotes that are ethnically charged. It is definitely a lot of people aren't aware how much ethnic tension exists within Russia,
and also the dialect, right? Like speaking Muscovite Russian versus the sort of we might call it Appalachian Russian that exists more in the stands and in Central Asia and in the sort of hinterland. Like in terms of sophistication, education, they might not be sitting there listening to Rachmaninoff quoting Pushkin. That's not necessarily always the case.
I would say, actually, I mean, Greg, you might correct me, but I think the distinctions between different forms of Russian, actually, in terms of language, occur actually much more within the Slavic Russian population than they do with non-Slavic Russian speakers, because they learned Russian through the Russian school system, right? So their Russian tends to be a lot more standardized, as opposed to, random Siberian Community 83 of Russians that, maybe they're old believers and therefore are sort of cut off from the rest of society.
Yeah, we're talking, everybody speaks the same language, but we're talking about the accents. People have distinct accents from various regions, but certainly they're not as distinguishable to outsiders as they are within Russia, like Muscovite accent versus St. Petersburg accent. There is distinction, but you have to be sometimes Professor Higgins, to distinguish those things. I'm most of the Russian population, even those who are minorities within Russian, whose primary language is Russian, they speak with very little accent. But the people from Asian areas who grew up there and who started to speak their own language, and Caucasus region, they often do have distinct accent.
Dagestan.
Yeah, I would say.
It's
Yeah, I would
the
say.
people are laughing at it. It sounds funny to some people. However, the educated people, really intellectuals from those regions, they actually often move to Moscow and St. Petersburg early on, and many of them don't have any accents.
Yeah, I would say it's probably more similar to the way that there's a Scottish accent, because there used to be a Scots language, and that heavily influenced the way Scottish people speak English, even if they don't speak Scots anymore. And so I think that's part of what's going on in Central Asia, where you have the influence of those indigenous Turkish or in the case of Tajikistan, Persian languages, and how it affects their English, their Russian. But
one quick point, Richard, I want to make about Shogu. So Shogu is sort of this really strange actor, because his career really started as, in essence, creating the modern version of FEMA, or National Disaster Command, and you could say sort of Homeland Security, not at the heavy duty security state level, but at the, there's floodwaters and you need to, fix the dam, or, help people evacuate, et cetera. And he spent really his first 20 years building that, which gave him enormous reputation. And that's even where his training is. His training is in that. And then he was shifted into military leadership really in the last decade, and really almost as sort of a administrative insider, not necessarily as a seasoned commander. And what really changed is in the last few years, he became much more front and center from what you would call a military command level. And that's the Shogu really that Pedrosa and others have attacked as not being fully competent, which I think is a probably fair attack, even though I don't support them, because I just don't think he has really that training. I mean, that's just not who he is. I mean, you can throw all the stars on his shirt collar you want, but that's not going to make him the equivalent of an Eastern Military District general, with 40 years experience in land warfare going back to the Soviet Union. I will say, if you needed somebody to deal with a significant disaster, he's actually proven to be incredibly competent at that. I mean, he really built the modern national internal, we call it disaster management, humanitarian aid sort of force structure across all of Russia, and made it for the first time ever Russia-wide, where if there's a disaster in Vladivostok, it's like there's an integration the same way as you would have in the United States, which for a large country is actually pretty unique. I mean, China doesn't have that. I mean, really, it's only the U.S. and Russia that have that right now in the whole world. So India doesn't have that. Most countries in Europe, in some ways, don't even have that. That is his competence. And so I think what makes him unique is that his loyalty to the regime and Putin's loyalty to him is that Putin sort of plucked him out of somebody who had a very strong reputation, wasn't a military person, so fresh eyes, as people would say, in many fields. And so Putin is clearly decided to be substantially loyal to him, more so than it seems like any other actually leader that he has.
Yeah, no, I sort of wanted to go to the next question, which is, can we walk through what Kadyrov's strategy is here in terms of a political goal? Because Kadyrov came into power as a direct result of the Russian military operations in Chechnya in the early 1990s. And these were violent operations against the Chechen people, whom Kadyrov is effectively the person representing these interests today. So why wouldn't Kadyrov seize this opportunity to take an anti-Russian or an anti-Putin position, try to declare autonomy? Why is he trying to defend Moscow, including against Prigozhin?
Well, I mean, oh, go ahead, Greg, if you want to go
Yeah,
first, please.
well, you see, Kadyrov is the creature of Putin. He wouldn't exist without Putin. He'd be like killed immediately. I mean, the country Chechnya right now is not economically you know. Viable. It's completely supported by Russian money, and the army of Kadyrov is paid from Russian Ministry of Defense by Putin. Kadyrov is only there because he serves Putin. He would never take anti-Putin position. As far as defending Putin, the Kadyrov's army is no match for Wagner. They're proved to be, they're just an empty threat. They're just like showing off a lot, but in the war with Ukraine, they proved to be very ineffective, and they mostly were held back because he wants to maintain. So in a way, you could think that the Kadyrov and his army is the personal guard of Putin. So there is no way he would act against Putin. He would be like out. He's got too many enemies in his country. He rules like a medieval lord, doing all kinds of horrible things there. If you think about it, he is the son of a celebrated imam who resisted, Russia.
That's right.
He has been bought out, and just because with Russian money he can hold it together so it doesn't rebel again. That's his only purpose. But he is acting like an asshole, big
Yeah.
time.
I mean, the one thing I would say is that it's pretty clear. I mean, these type of warlord, gang, mafia type leaders, they tend to be very capable in their backyard, right? They have geographical and topographical domination, meaning fantastic local intelligence. They know the terrain, born, raised, live, die, multi-generation. So they can fight in the backyard as well as anyone can fight in the backyard. When you decide to say, okay, let's now take this jumbled group of territorial gangs and now try to turn them into an expeditionary force. Well, a whole bunch of things have to happen. Logistics, command, control, you actually have to have capabilities that match the fight you're going into, not necessarily the fight in your backyard. And this is shown when he sort of did his own little counter thunder run, or attempted to meet Wagner. It was sort of like I think it was basically unplanned. I think he heard about it, and probably somewhere between Telegram channels, word on the street that Wagner's going up M4. So he said, "Hey guys, let's just let's get the crew together and jump on the vehicles and let's roll." Well, that happened until their vehicles started breaking down, because they obviously don't structure logistics like a military does, where you have fully maintained vehicles that are built to go X 100 kilometers and have maintenance cycles and on and on and on, right? Which, when you run your backyard sort of, junkyard dog kind of, gang, mafia, warlord, and it's very practical. Your logistic trains tend to be quick, like QRF, like quick reaction force groups, which you tend to get in very light vehicles. You tend to use generally civilian vehicles, maybe trucks, technical type trucks, like the Toyota trucks, Helixes, etc. And that's it, right? And you tend to have more of a gas station maintenance cycle. Everybody's their own mechanic. And that works in those environments because you're generally not going more than 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers to get to your fight, whatever the fight even is. And many times it's not even a fight. Many times it's just a show of force. You can get there faster than somebody else. You can jump off the vehicle. You can start barking and yelling and shooting rounds in the air. That's very different than, trying to meet I mean, this is one of the hardest things to do that ever exists, which is a force moving along a large mobilized route, and no route reconnaissance, and try to meet that force at a point of junction. That's a very unique thing. If you look at what General Patton did in World War II, I mean, you look at what a few Soviet generals did on the Eastern Front. I mean, this is like, it's so rare that actually happens. It actually almost never happens. And so it was almost absurd when I remember reading about this happening or listening to it. I just laughed, and I talked to other friends. It was just like, there's just no way. Like, if he gets there, what are they going to do? He's going to get there with this train, and it's almost going to be like a cartoon, and say, wait, I'm not going to fight you yet. I'm still waiting on everybody else to get here in the next 3 hours, because that's how those type of small forces move, because the vehicles are different, right? One of the reasons you have standardization in the military for large logistics is that everything can move at a standard rate, so you can keep convoys together. You could be organized. So when you've got a whole bunch of different Nissans, Toyotas, and everything, grab bag like you would, get down the street, it gets pretty, and different weight ratios, it gets pretty different pretty quickly. People start speeding up. People don't know what they're doing. So at the end of the day, that was never going to happen. I think in the end, his spin on this was, I'm showing my 100%, loyalty to the regime. He proved his regime loyalty by even trying, even though they only got about a third of the way there, to meet Wagner. The big thing that happened, I think, is that this new chessboard that Putin's going to have to figure out, his close cadre of, probably 50 people, 30 people, are going to have to figure out is, what's the right balance of reorganizing and resetting without being so disruptive. Because, in these type of autocratic configured systems, you have a lot of power that goes unfed, that as you go deeper and deeper into these systems, people just don't have. It's a lot of information asymmetry, right? You don't have very transparent information. I mean, like in modern countries, you don't have a ministry of energy and then a whole nother one that sits outside of it in parallel, that everybody doesn't know what's going on in. I mean, people could conspiracize and blah, 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 but like in the real world, that's not happening, because it just doesn't work like that at a financial, logistic, managerial, operational level. In a place like Russia, when it comes to a lot of the sources of power, you have a lot of that going on. And so if you reset everything, I mean, it's just chaos. It'll take years. And that's a vacuum that I don't think is what Russia or what Putin and the regime are going to do. But they have to figure out how to reset maybe the top pieces and create enough, in their version, healthy loyalty and competition to the regime loyalty, that it makes it really clear that we're in power. And I believe Putin's going to have to do something big at some point. I'm not saying it's going to be effective, but something big to reset sort of the apex predator in the room at some point. He just can't sort of just pretend this didn't like this happened. It's going to be, he's going to have to do something to prove he's the alpha at some point.
We actually
and that's
have
going to be sort of the tension.
We actually have a comment sort of to this point, that Russia's effectively a sleeping woman and it will need a stronger man to rouse her, kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. So why don't we talked a little bit about the escalating rivalry. You sort of pointed that out. Is there anything else that you want to mention about that, or do you want to move forward, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that's pretty clear is that all these PMCs, we'll call it their period of independence is over. They're all going to be somewhere between completely folded into the Ministry of Defense, and I think what you're going to find is an enormous amount of these people leaving, because there's a reason they're not in the army to begin with. Either that just their personality and kind of their behavior, or their background. right? I mean, they are just even, I think because of media, bad movies and all these kind of things, we overestimate how chaotic, cruel, psychopathic everyone is everywhere in Russia, because that's just not true, right? It's a very tiny percentage of the population. And when it comes to the army, you might have handful of people who are like that, but it's not 60%, 80% of the army. The army is made up mostly of conscripts who are coming in to do their year contract, and then you have a professional cadre. Most of them are heads down people. Not to say they can't be tough and cruel and so on, but they're not. They're absolutely not maniacs running around. And I think most people who are in these PMCs, like most PMCs all over the world, are definitely not people at that point in their career who are looking for a military career. And so I think most of these people are just going to bleed away. I would say probably at least half of them. I think that's good. And you're going to find them in other conflicts. They're going to probably recreate shadow PMCs. They're more than likely, this is an all-time period of mafia recruiting in Russia. I think the Russian mafia, this is a gold mine for them. They're going to be able to get, as they would call, talent, that's been developed. And so that's how I think is going to happen to most of these PMCs. And this is a blow to the Russian regime, because the Russian regime has been counting on these, 25 or 50 PMCs for the better part of a decade. I mean, you could argue this was an innovation in their hybrid war strategy in the last 10 to 15 years, is generate tens of thousands of these people who can run around and do thousands of, near abroad missions that are fairly deniable, low cost, and have almost no blowback politically on the regime internally or externally, because most people in some ways see these people as sort of renegade mercenary. And if something happens to you, well, what you signed up for. So I think the Russians are going to have to figure out either how to pull back these type of operations, or re-incentivize these people, pay them more, give them a bigger cut, which is probably my guess of what they're going to try to do, especially all the operations they have going on in Africa, right? They can't afford to lose that position, because I think that's going to be, so I think that's a big shift that we're going to see. So it's a huge opportunity by a lot of Western states to push back on Russian power that they leverage with the PMCs all over the world.
Yeah, we have a quote we have a comment sort of related to that Wagner has been aggressively expanding its massive asset harvesting brutally in Central African Republic and in a number of other countries where Wagner income has been estimated at a minimum of $500 million per year.
Yeah, I would say it's at least that much. I mean, and that's their income. Forget about what they're generating for the state, right? They're clearly generating. I mean, if you count soft and hard power and economics, they're generating tens of billions a year, right? Because you have, better part of a dozen regimes that have fairly robust loyalty to the Russian state and support, and they're able to integrate into the Russian raw material and natural resources sort of ecosystem of trading ecosystem. So that's going to be paramount. So you're going to see, you're going to see a Ministry of Defense and sort of imposition in those places. But that's going to take a lot of people out of this Ukrainian fight, right? And when I say a lot of people, we're very competent people, right? I mean, by Russian standards that they need. I mean, I don't mean hundreds of thousands. I mean, because there aren't hundreds of thousands of these people all over the world combined, right? So losing a few hundred of your key people who can make important decisions and having to move them around to fill in these PMC gaps, that's a big deal, right? Because
I think that's where Prigozhin will end up, in my opinion, because it would be very hard for Putin to control those forces in Africa, while Prigozhin has a lot of influence there, and I'm sure he's going to cut out his own regions there, and suck out, become kind of independent warlord. I think that's Of course, it's an assumption, but that's what I think will
Yeah, that's a
happen.
great. I mean, if you're modeling this, I think him
Yeah.
becoming the Russian African division senior vice president, I think that's probably a very strong of all the
Yeah,
options.
and Putin wants him out, and
Yep.
he may
Out
kind
of
of
Europe,
tolerate
out of
him on
Eurasia.
semi
Yep.
kind of loyal, arrangement, because it would be very difficult to overcome Prigozhin there. He doesn't want to get into open conflict in Africa, especially during the war.
Well, and especially if it's generating, and in a strange way, this is where Prigozhin can sort of rebuild his reputation with Putin. Not that he'd ever be. I mean, I think we overestimate how trusted he was to begin with. I mean, so I think he was clearly trusted enough to have the roles he had, but he wasn't in the inner circle.
He was trusted implicitly by Putin because he was his cook. He used to serve him food. Yeah. This is like the highest degree of trust. So that's why Putin took it so hard, because it was a personal betrayal. They had a personal relationship.
No, that's fair. That's a fair point at that personal level. But what I mean is trusted as an equal actor on the power stage that can like a pure oligarch, super oligarch.
Now he's not going to trust him at all. But he was not a full-fledged oligarch like others, because first of all, he is a criminal, and that creates a lot of problems even within Russia. You usually is cut out from the top echelon.
That's right. And actually, this is a very important point. People underestimate how legalistic Russia and how administratively legalistic Russia actually is. And being a criminal, like you said, a real criminal, what we would say is a significant felony convictions, that gets you X'd out of most of the most powerful positions in the state, across, not just politically but even economically. And so I do think, as a gray land leader of Africa, I think for Russia, I think that's probably a very safe place. It gives everyone the return on investment they need. And I think at the end of the day, if he can squeeze another $1 billion out of this, which I think he can, if he stays alive, and he can, support, Belarus indirectly, and they need all the support they can get if they're going to be sustained in this sort of Russian sphere, because right now Russia can't afford to support Belarus the way Belarus needs to be supported, and fight the war in Ukraine, and support all of these, let's say, extra military activities they've had, and protect the state and reset the state, all at the same time. They just don't. They're just too stretched politically, economically, and I'd say even capability-wise, managerially. This is just too much. So, and one advantage having Wagner in Belarus for Russia is it throws a little bit of chaos, not real chaos, but it throws a little bit of chaos on that eastern flank of NATO, and it will force NATO to have to get much more serious about force protection in that region, whether it's Poland, whether it's the Baltics, because you have essentially tens of thousands of Wagnerians that are sitting, they're spread across Belarus.
If we could move a little bit more into the coup, Greg, why is it that when Prigozhin moved to Rostov-on-Don and was able to take the entire city, that he generally had either a positive or neutral reception in what had effectively been a Russian military headquarters?
I think people didn't realize that this is an open rebellion. Because it just happened so fast. They liked his remarks, Prigozhin's remark in general, because they were really criticizing, giving very honest criticism, something that everybody was afraid to say about the army he was saying. So he was very popular. When he moved in, I don't think people realized that this is open rebellion, that they're going to move on Moscow. They just treated them as heroes of the war, who proved themselves to be so great that they took the what's the name of the city? Escaped me.
Voronezh?
Just recently.
Voronezh?
No. I'm talking about Ukrainian Bakhmut.
Bakhmut?
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
They took Bakhmut. The heroes of Bakhmut. So that's why they treated them so. But there were some people who kind of understood, who thought it was wrong. But I don't think they supported the rebellion. I don't think people of Rostov supported him because they supported the rebellion.
Got it.
No, I would agree. And one thing we should realize is that this whole chain of events is 24 hours. It's June 24th. I mean, from start to finish. So it's a really strange, and I think this is the only way to look at it, for a massive global nation state to have something of this magnitude, soup to nuts, from it getting kicked off as they were, moving on Rostov to their negotiated deal. End to end, this was basically a 24-hour affair. I think a couple things that's important about how Wagner overtook Rostov is, number one, having been so integrated into their command for so long. I mean, they knew everything. They knew the schedules, they knew the shifts, they knew the quality people. I mean, they could pick their time, place, and location, or pretty close to it, on when they could strike. And I think something very important is that the upper cadre, we'll call it the core full-time cadre of Wagner, is very experienced. I mean, let's say the top 2,000 fighters that they have, or members of Wagner, they're extremely experienced. And I think what's critical is that they're very experienced working in small units. Let's say units smaller, platoons and smaller, and that gives them, at least at the shock level, lots of force multipliers, right? Because they could hit with very small groups of 10, 20 people over and over again if they needed to. And so I think their ability to seize it was almost a fait accompli. I mean, the Russians would have to know it's coming, have everything in place to stop it, and be prepared to have a city under siege, which just was not going to happen. And it's pretty clear that Wagner had very strong reconnaissance and intelligence on the ground. So when they struck, it was just boom, they just swept right in. And what was unique about this is they just said, go about your business in the Russian Central Military Command. It was incredible, really. So the people just kept working, moving logistics around, moving people around, etc. So it was almost like a parallel world, like it was like the Matrix or Blade Runner. So, a couple of things is that the Russian, so the force that they came with was, basically a company of tanks. They were newer tanks, which was, I think, smart on their part, or the newest tanks. They had grads and howitzers, but most importantly, they brought, air defense systems. So they knew, the Russians, they knew that the fastest response the Russians could have would be an air force. Absolutely. And so
now,
yep.
If this is sort of like the cat and mouse game of like, okay, they know that the fastest response is going to be an air response. Putin also knows that they know that the fastest response is going to be an air response. And certainly Shoigu and Gerasimov wouldn't have been promoted at all if they didn't have that sort of insight. So then why did they send their most advanced helicopters, half of which were shot out of the air?
The way this goes down in the real world is that you aren't doing simulation plans. I mean, they are now, so they'll be very capable in the future of stopping this. But there's very few states, almost none, that sit around and say, "Oh, let's put a red team together, and how would you attack and take over X internally?" I don't mean how would you just attack it like a terrorist. That's different. I mean, how would you
How would you
actually
assert control?
how would you assert control?
Yeah, but I don't think they were planning attack Wagner force with helicopters. It was mostly for surveillance. It's just
Well-
the Wagner force responded very decisively, by
Exactly.
shooting them down. But they were not planning to, because it was too small of a force. They would have sent the Air Force and helicopter. I mean,
Well, yeah, they would have killed most of their own people if they had been doing this.
Yeah,
I think
they just want surveillance, and
yeah,
but
I
the
think the
Wagner
real
force shoot them
issue.
down.
I think the real issue is that. Sorry, Greg. The real issue is that once they went up the M4, that triggered a whole different. I mean, that was a whole different game now, right? I mean, obviously, taking Rostov is like kind of like taking the Pentagon. Not really. I mean, it's probably more like taking,
It was more like Fort Bragg.
No, but
Yeah.
that was the central command
In
for the
central command.
Ukrainian operation, for the
Yeah,
whole
so
Ukrainian war.
yeah.
I mean,
so
they took the whole operation down. I mean, by this.
it's more akin in the U.S. of a. I mean, this is where it gets ridiculous, obviously, in most other places in the world. Of a force taking Joint Base MacDill and U.S. Central Command, right? Like that's just sort of shock, and then somebody doing a thunder run up 95, right? Like that's sort of which up 95 is how you get to Washington D.C. And the only difference is, imagine Washington D.C. is where Atlanta is, right? It's that close. So I think actually if you go back a couple more, there we go. Keep going back. So if you look here, so the thunder, so what happened is they did this thunder run up M4, and they got to within 200 kilometers of Moscow. They shot down basically. I mean, the most important thing that happened, you could argue, I mean, I don't mean politically, but sort of militarily, they shot down one of it's estimated 4 AWACS, which is to prove Greg's point of surveillance. One of the Russian 4, AWACS planes that they have domestically. So that's actually a huge loss, because you're not replacing one of those, that takes years. And who knows what the state of maintenance are on the others. So that's actually a pretty big deal. The transport planes and the combat helicopters. So the one thing the Russians did do is that once the Wagner was moving up the M4, they did start bombing it, right? So they recognized, and clearly the Russian Air Force made a concerted plea to say, look, we can just hammer these guys all the way up, and then that would buy us time, to set the defenses in Moscow. So I mean, in the end, I do think this was almost the open rebellion was getting to Rostov. The sort of insurrection was moving up M4. And I think it was a bet by, the Wagner people to see if they could get people coming out of their houses.
Now, one curiosity I have is sort of in the aftermath of this thunder run, especially as Prigozhin says, this is the way we should have attacked Ukraine. This is the way we should have taken Kiev. Greg, so how would this have affected, the Russian consciousness of, like, we had military leaders who could have seen the way it would have been done, and they weren't being listened to, that Ukraine was executed so poorly, when you even had the competence available to come to a different conclusion?
Yeah, but we're talking about there was a planning of this whole operation, the Ukrainian operation to begin with.
Yep.
And first of all, it's my understanding that the reason why they took Rostov so fast is because the order was given not to resist.
Yeah.
And the troops are just stayed out, and a lot of people left. As a matter of fact, Shoigu and Gerasimov was supposed to be right there at the Central Command, and they left. So that was not the situation in Kiev. They were, I don't think they could have taken Kiev in that way at all. It was a false planning to begin with. They are completely underestimated of what's happening with Ukraine, not only militarily, but also with how the people feel, and the people would.
Right. But the difference, I would say, is that it's not about the reality of whether it would have worked. It's about the Russian perception of whether it could have worked. So are you sort of intimating that Russians would understand that even if Prigozhin's style of attack had occurred on February 22nd of 2022, that it wouldn't have worked, or that this view could actually be persuasive because they don't know as much?
Honestly, to tell the truth, I have not heard this question in the media, and I'm talking about the opposition media and anything. Nobody even pondered about this. I don't think they really think that way, that the Prigozhin could have been successful in taking Kiev. I think they're past that. I don't think they make that comparison.
Another comment that came up sort of related to this in a sort of tangential way is that prior to this attack, Putin primarily stayed in his center in Moscow. He never left the Kremlin or the surrounding areas. And now he's in Dagestan and some of the other more remote provinces trying to galvanize support. What do you think is the thought process behind this? Do you think that there's a possibility that this could be successful in drumming up support? What's going on here?
You know what I think? First of all, Putin did go, in a bunker in somewhere, Altai Mountains, which is an Asian part, pretty often. So it's not like he always stayed in Moscow. He's like, but certainly there is a lot of the talk, especially in the opposition, how he cowardly escaped, how he is, but I don't think in the media, in the Russian media, people talk like that at all. It's downplayed. What I think is important is that here in the opposition and in the Western media, they talk a lot about how weakened Putin is, how he is his image is demolished, and now there is his days are numbered, and all of this, and I think it's very important that I think it may be true, because we don't know what can happen. Maybe he is weakened and something will happen, but on the other hand, sounds a lot like a wishful thinking, and what I heard from one of the interesting analysts, Andrei Illarionov, he said, well, look at what happened in Turkey when there was an uprising against Erdogan. Look what happened. He only, became stronger as a result of it, because he purged a lot of people. He used this to gather support, and there is a strong possibility that Putin, maybe he'll approach it differently, but he could actually come out stronger out of this, because now he clearly sees who really he can rely upon and who is not. I mean, he still has people who stayed with him, so who knows? He may become he may just take out the weeds and become stronger. But on the other hand, well, maybe he is, we don't know, but I'm just saying that we have to see both sides. We cannot just get seduced into like wishful thinking that, okay, he is okay, now we see, that's it, now he's so shaken that he's probably going to fall soon. Could be, but we have to see both sides.
Yeah, I completely agree with Greg. I think both can be true. Right, he can be weaker, but this offers him a substantial opportunity to sort of cleanse the decks. And I think the Erdogan example is a great one. And by the way, the Turkey, the coup attempt in Turkey was a real attempt. I mean, that when you look at the sources of power, how it was established, it was a Special Forces Regiment colonel that was the sort of key organizer of it. And you had a very, very surgical attempt at a regime change. So that was far greater. I mean, that was probably an order
Yeah,
of
I was
magnitude
going to
greater
say,
risk.
you and I may disagree about how real the 2016 coup was, but the Turkish military has a long history of doing this. By the
That's
way,
right.
shout out my history series on Wednesday nights, not this Wednesday, but Wednesday following. And the Wednesday following that, those 2 Wednesdays in later July, we will be covering the modern Turkish state. And so we'll be talking a lot about the coups and the coup
Yeah.
structure
I
and how it
figured you
works.
were, so I was sort of teeing that up. I was hoping
Y-
you'd take the bait on
Yeah.
that.
So, but no, what Prigozhin was doing doesn't look like a coup unless he expected Gerasimov and Shoigu to stay in Rostov-on-Don. Because if that was the case and he could get them isolated and either kill them or somehow force them out of the country, then he becomes the only defense game in town.
Well, I mean, I think that's his sort of delusion, which I do think at that point, he's actually, for his own long-term security, he's actually lucky that they
Yeah.
weren't there. Because if he has the deputy minister of defense, he has the deputy chief of staff, he has the chief of staff, if he truly is holding hostage in a Middle Ages way the defense leadership of the country, I think that triggers a very radically different. It forces Putin to have a very radically different response, because that at that point is an attempt to take out the regime national security leadership infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that's a radical escalation. I mean, what he did is he found the handful of leaders that were there and he punked them on social media basically. And, they all ran around and high-fived each other and took selfies and, and then found a bunch of their, sycophants that were, in town or just people who wanted to go out when there's crazy stuff happening.
Yeah, I was gonna
And
say,
that's sort of where it ended when it comes to Rostov. And then they went on this funky half-baked thunder run, I think, believing. And by the way, we should not underestimate ever when it comes to whether it's a Putin or a Prigozhin or any other autocratic leader, that relative to their most extremes, that they're the moderating force, right? So under his leadership, I wouldn't be shocked if there's 5 or 10 or many other commanders that a Prigozhin has that really did want regime change or really did want had a radically different sort of delusional vision of what could be done.
right.
And
But
so
I think that calling these people moderates is sort of misleading as well.
I
It's
didn't say
like saying,
moderate, but
yeah, no,
moderating.
moderating.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be the same thing as like saying Ismail Haniyeh, who is the Hamas leader who governs Gaza, is a moderating influence because he's less inclined to attack Israel
I mean, if
than the
you're going to
Palestinian
be
Islamic Jihad and several of the other terrorist entities that are in Gaza.
sure,
So,
but if
like,
you're looking at daily decision making, and you have 10 people who say, "Let's go to the wall," and you have
one guy who says,
"Hey,
wait 2
let's slow
days.
down."
Yeah. All right. I want to sort of pivot a little bit.
Yeah.
You mentioned that we weren't going to discuss it, but I kind of do want to discuss Ukraine's incredibly powerful and successful counteroffensive that has made territorial gains of about 5 kilometers.
Yeah.
So what is going on here? Why is Ukraine not able to capitalize with all this Western equipment, tanks? They've even gotten a base on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River near Kherson. Like, why are they not able to just?
So, I mean, in the next presentation, so we only have, half an hour left, so we could, focus on this now. But in the next presentation, I can have, my plan was to have a, a much more rigorous breakdown in that. So this one was focused completely on that. If you go to the old presentation, you'll see that had more of that material. If we're going to sort of stay very simple in narrative right now, look, the Russians have had enough time, and they have enough tactical and technical leadership in the system that they've been able to construct fairly robust defense in depth. And with their artillery capabilities, which are substantial, they've been able to create a, almost, nothing's impossible, but a very, very challenging environment for Ukrainians to have a significant breakthrough, especially, and I think this is the key, without the Ukrainians having really any air power of significance. And I think the thing that's missed is that when people say air power, I think they always think of fighting jets, and that's one part of it. That allows you to build your basically your air cap, right? Like basically having all your air contested space under control, or at least you're able to challenge for that control. But the more tactical air is your close air support, which typically is in slower moving, but more armored and much heavier firepower jets and armored helicopters, which will have substantial losses. I mean, over long enough period of time, 50, maybe even 75%. But their ability to sync up with the combined arms force, allows a breakthrough to potentially happen. So I think one of the things that is realistic here is that the Ukrainians are recognizing they're going to have to adjust their configuration of combat power, so that they're not going to be able to form these huge corps and huge divisions, because the thing about those is they require enormous concentration and mass, while they're, you can't secretly prepare a division or a corps, armored corps, for a massive counteroffensive. And if there is ISR, if there's intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance going on, and that's a real problem for the Ukrainians going forward. So I think what's going to happen is the Ukrainian capabilities, which are still, I think, months away, probably quarters, maybe even up to a year, where they can launch multiple thrusts, of which some of the thrusts are more faint, to generate a Russian response where those feints exist. And those feints will still be pretty large. They might be 2-3 brigades each. And then you have your larger thrusting force, which might be a corps. And then that does a much larger flanking or envelopment maneuver, large scale combined arms, maneuver warfare. Because the Russians are so hyper entrenched, this isn't a simplistic World War I trench line that you usually see in a movie. Like, the movies actually do a terrible job at giving you a sense of, oh, there's one big long trench. Like, no, there was 50 trenches, right? And and then there was artillery lined up perfectly to hammer all those trenches if at any point, if there was any penetration. And that's often, or more often than not, what the Ukrainians have to deal with.
Go ahead. I just wanted to offer some perspective of Ukrainian analyst, very famous in Ukraine by the name Arestovich, and what he's saying, basically, yeah, of course, the Russians, created very deep defense lines, like by all science, military science, and also wide areas of mining. They mine the whole front, and it's very hard to overcome. And he said because they don't have air support, they said the earliest they could get like F-16 maybe in October. But what he said, that what they're doing right now is that they're trying to, by kind of attacking in many fronts, they're trying to bring reserves. He said right now it's a question of who is, and they feel that they are succeeding in this, that the Russians have to bring more and more reserves to the front lines to fill the gaps, while Ukrainians are not doing this to the same extent, and eventually it's just like thin out the line and trying to utilize all the Russian reserves, and then only then they would maybe able to break it through. So right now he thinks that they are not counting on breaking through anywhere significantly. But hopefully he believes that within a couple of months they would be able to thin out the Russian reserves, and this might happen. So that's his perspective.
My take on this, and in the next presentation I'm going to present some information on this. This is my take on this, which I know a few people have some take on this, is that we're in this phase of this conflict that the best analogy is the Iran war, where neither side has anywhere near the combination of the force composition, competence, capabilities, maneuver, mobility, combined arms, all the pieces that you need together to radically reshape the battle space. Neither side has anywhere near that. I don't know. I think the Ukrainians, in theory, within a year could have that at the probably realistic earliest. I don't know if the Russians, without taking astronomical losses, that they just won't take.
I think the Iran-Iraq war is actually a really great parallel for what's going on here, because the traditional view in sort of military science 101 is that World War I was a unique phenomenon where you had defensive weapons that were significantly stronger than offensive weapons, which means that you can build these trenches, and when you have these trenches constructed, they're much more effective at resisting the waves of enemy attack than they are at themselves creating a new attack. And throughout World War I, you had the attempts by the various powers, be they Allied or Central, Entente or Central, to overcome this. And the eventually successful way of defeating this and creating an offensive technique that was more effective than the trench was the tank. And the tank was able to survive multiple hits of machine gun fire and get to the other trench, and therefore, launch a successful attack. So that was effectively the change that we then see in World War II, where we really don't have trenches anymore, right? The tank is the effective mobilization technique, but on both the Nazi German side and on the Allied side. So what makes Iran, Iraq, and Ukraine so strange is that we have tanks, and we have tanks on both sides, but we're in a situation where, because of lack of support, because of the effectiveness of new defensive weaponry and anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons, that you have a stronger position on defense than you do on offense. So
Absolutely.
you can't do these effective long distance offensives that will prevail over the defensive position.
That's exactly right. And if you look at the scale, oh, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, but we don't see this in most other conflicts, like the Persian Gulf War and the Iraq War. We don't see this, right? We don't see this in other modern wars. So the key element, and maybe Aaron, you can clarify this or explain where I'm missing it here, is that in a lot of those other cases where you have strong offensives, even with all this good defensive technology, is effective air support and effective sea support and effective missile support that can counteract these defensive measures so the tanks can continue to move forward.
Yeah. So I mean, and the real key is that you also have to have, and it's, as you can see, after 18 months, this is very slow and almost nearly impossible to build while you have a conflict going on. You have to redevelop a force that can train and build competence in combined arms and true total combined arms. And when you are missing pieces of that combined arms, triad, basically the air pieces, which the Ukrainians miss completely, then it's much more limited. It really isn't fully combined arms. It's combined land arms is what it basically is. And I would also argue, given some of the imposition that the limitations that the Ukrainians have, they're forced on it by their as a Western proxy at this point, and as their own obviously independent state, seeking its own territorial integrity. They're highly constrained on what and where they can target. So that's where it looks a hell of a lot like Iran and Iraq, where outside of the sort of air thunder runs that the Iranians and Iraqis would do on each other's capitals and random missile launches, which were really almost performative. I mean, they're awful for the civilian populations that they wounded and killed, but in terms of their value to the conflict was pretty irrelevant. The Iran-Iraq War showed that neither side over a decade plus could had the military science cadre training culture to develop combined arms and strategy to generate maneuver breakthroughs, even though they had, by inventory definition, all these pieces that you can use for that. If you don't have the technical, political, operational, and strategic mindset to redevelop your whole doctrine around that, you just won't get it. You're not going to get it through osmosis. It's not going to happen telepathically. I think the Ukrainians are intellectually trying to do that. I don't know if they're going to be technically able to do that. It's not an easy thing to do. I mean, truly speaking, the US, the UK, the French, and then through, kind of composite forces, NATO, can do that. Everybody else has never proven they could do that. And they could spend trillion. I mean, it's not money's a part of it, obviously, but it's fundamentally building this hyper integrated doctrine. So in the West, we call it going purple, which if you take all the different colors of the uniforms from the navies, the air forces, the Marines, the armies, etc., you build this sort of hypothetical color called purple, and that's joint operations. So building these complex, this is all part of something called complex operations. So building complex joint operations are the most difficult thing that we've ever done in warfare. And do I think the Ukrainians can do complex joint operations? They'll be able to do some. I do not believe they're going to be able to do continuous joint complex operations. That's
I was
what
going
you
to say,
have to do.
one of the things that always confuses me a little bit, and might confuse other observers of conflict, is that we're talking about large-scale forces of both Russia and Ukraine meeting each other on the battlefield, hundreds of thousands of individuals. But then when we talk about these elite units like Wagner or like these joint purple task forces that you've just described, we're talking about a few thousand individuals across the entire military who are
maximum
of doing these things. So how is it that you have these small groups of a few thousand that can so fundamentally change the aspect of a titanic clash between these large-scale militaries? Wouldn't it make sense if like the military meeting each other was only 5,000 people in 2000, or these special forces so that they would have an outsized impact?
Well, I mean, so the best analogy I would give you is, given that you're a lawyer, in the United States, we have million point two, whatever the number is. The lawyers are people that have passed the bar, and probably another 500,000 that have gone to law school, and the same number probably in Europe and many other places. How many people? I mean, most people who are in the industry could maybe name the 50, if there is 50, 100 max, that could argue cases in front of the Supreme Court that are that fully capable, or even appellate cases. Maybe it's a few hundred, maybe it's 500, right? So we're talking at the top echelon of being a lawyer, at least when it comes to litigating. And there's probably in every subfield, a few hundred people. So, the best lawyers in the world, out of the 5 million or whatever there are in the whole world, or 10 million, some number like that, there's probably 10,000, 20,000.
Right,
And
but I would say the fundamental distinction here, right, is that a soldier has to change battlefield conditions. The lawyer simply is able of going in front of the Supreme Court because they've had so much practice at doing law that other lawyers say, you're probably better suited to this than I am, and therefore cede the pitch to them.
It's a lot closer, because the only way you get this expert that you're talking about is decades of training. Most of it's training. And then I'm just making up the number, but let's say for every 20 training exercises you do, or 30, in a particular area of specialty, you actually go do it for real at least once. And you have a feedback loop of learning, and not just you by yourself, but the whole cadre, the whole development of you and everybody else. And there's this continuous learning. It's actually probably a lot closer to, actually probably even a better analogy is to being a medical professional in surgery and being an expert in a subspecialty, is that, it becomes so hyper specialized that, and understand the reason all these specialized units were ever created was the asymmetrical nature of war, or conflict, as it's developed the last 50 plus years, where you become very dependent on reconnaissance, on counterterrorism, on special missions. But when you get to large conventional efforts and fight amongst peer foes, those units just don't provide, outside of their reconnaissance and special mission use, they don't provide that much value outside of that. They can't. And we're not used to this because we've gotten so used to the narrative in our media, right? I mean, for every tank, sort of, boring, large, heavy movie that's out there in any language in the world, how many cool CIA special operations type, movie is there? There's probably a ratio of 20 to 1 or 50 to 1. So we've acculturated ourselves that these people are sort of like superheroes, part of DC or Marvel comics, and they can do sort of magic, Terminator, Predator type stuff on the battlefield. And that's just not the real world. And to be honest, it's the exact opposite. To do these complex joint combined arms maneuver campaigns are fundamentally a hyper intellectual exercise that is then augmented with, just hundreds of rounds, cycles of simulation, training exercises, assessments, and then retraining, re-exercises. So it's almost the exact opposite. And the amount of organization that exists in the world to do this is a very tight number in the world. It's 2 or 3, 4, and we're trying to sort of help Ukrainians sort of construct one of these on the fly by going to Target and Costco and Tesco and any grocery store with duct tape and toothpicks and band-aids and rubber bands.
Yeah, you need a lot more training and a lot more infrastructure.
Yeah,
So,
and to be very blunt, you need a generational cycle to build the doctrine. And that you can't really speed that up by much. Maybe you could cut it down by 2/3 the time. You're not collapsing the time to get that in by 100-fold, where people learn this in, a few weeks or a month or two. It's maybe a few years realistically. And that's not to do everything. That's to do something very explicit. And like I have a theory that I think is the potential high risk operation that would take a few years for the Ukrainians to develop the capabilities to do, but it could have a shocking effect on the battlefield. And what that would be is Ukrainians building over probably 2 years of training and development, at least 2 Marine divisions, and all of the small craft that you would require, and then through mixed with other campaigns to create pressure on the Russian forces in other places, you then launch, many small unit amphibious assaults on the greater Crimea area with substantial losses. All amphibious operations of any size always have substantial losses, 10, 20, 30%, just literally getting to the beach. And then usually a same percentage holding and attacking from the beach. But it would be so disruptive against the Russian command and decision structure that it would force the Russians to have to make a choice, which is, are we going to defend Crimea for real? And they have to get into a street by street fight here, or are we going to try to hold this 1,500 kilometer long front and hold Crimea at the same time? But I don't think the Ukrainians are going to do this. I don't think they're asking for it. I don't think we're maybe recommending it. I think our objectives have gotten a lot smaller, even though the losses over the next 2 years will probably be the same that you would have in something like that. And I'm not suggesting I'm some military genius. I'm just pointing, because I don't think this is a military genius activity. I think you have to, for the Ukrainians to disrupt this battle space significantly enough, they're going to have to develop really substantial capabilities in areas that they don't have. And they're going to take 1 to 2 years at least to build these, while they're maintaining the fight and degrading the people and the material they have in the meantime. This is why this is a very challenging thing that, I treat this more like Iran-Iraq, where it's a frozen conflict until there's some moment that exhaustion has been reached on all parties and they all want to sort of turn the table and flip to something else. If I have to bet right now, that's my bet. That was really my bet from the beginning. Once the failed invasion in the first, few weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks happened, I said, this thing's going to run for at least, and I know you've heard me say this, at least 3 to 5 years. And at this point, after a year and a half, I put the numbers closer to 4 to 8 years now, unless the Ukrainians build a very different capability to change the equation on the battlefield.
Now, this is a question that came in the comments, and I'm going to sort of add a little color of my own to it. You have the situation with the minority ethnicities in Russia. Ramzan Kadyrov is probably the clearest case here, but they are making clear commitments to the Russian state. They're being mobilized at higher percentages than are ethnic Slavs. They are, quote unquote patriotic, to the extent that we can use that term with respect to Russia. Now, does the war provide an opportunity for these groups to begin to assert some sort of indigenous rights, some sort of collective governance? For example, we know in Sakha Republic, right, the Sakha people have about 50% population there, and they have a significant degree of autonomy. Whereas if you compare it to the Tatars in Tatarstan, who are also about 50% of the oblast, they have a lot less power. The same with the Buryats in Buryatia, who are about 30% of the population of the region. To what degree can decolonization occur, or indigenous rights, or other elements within the framework of the war? Or is the war completely separate from whatever movements those may be?
I think it's totally separate, and I'll let Greg jump in here, obviously. But I do think one aspect, especially after this rebellion, is that Putin is going to seek out wherever he can opportunities to show immense alpha apex predator behavior. So if there's any other movement somewhere, he's going to seek to crush or use that as an opportunity to hyper co-opt it in a very aggressive manner. He has to reestablish that he is the apex predator, right? He's the polar bear. And if, I mean, does he really have to do that? Or, I mean, who knows? But I mean, I think by the standards that have been established, he absolutely has to do that, so that people could say, okay, he had a bad day, or a bad week or whatever. But, it's still the same, Putin that we know of and his inner circle. So I think any indigenous rights or any shift in existing balance of power in any region that is not sanctioned by the state is going to be met with, I would say, a pretty devastating response. It's the only thing that makes sense right now for him.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think it would be taken as a betrayal, and so I don't think this is the question. It's only can happen if there is a collapse of central power. But until that happens, I don't think anything significant movement in that direction could take place. I also think that those regions, more remote regions, are not necessarily more patriotic. They're just more exposed to propaganda. They have less information. They have maybe less concentration of intelligentsia, because they're all trying to move to the centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg. In the standards of living in Russia is not like I'm talking about the distribution is not like in the United States. In the United States, the standards of living if not completely equal, but to some degree, there is some. In Russia, there's a big difference between, let's say, Moscow and some Sakhalin. I mean, it's like a day and night. So those people are more exposed to propaganda. They're less capable of getting all the information. And they feel powerless. So I think there were some movements against the getting their sons and husbands into army, but it was it was not significant. It was put down fairly easily. So it's this is the reality in Russia. So I don't think decolonization will happen without collapse of the central power.
Yeah, and I would say one of the most underrated or very minor reported events the last 20 years in Russia that I've always felt was probably the most important, one of the maybe 5 most important aspects of Putin and his core regime creating dominant power in Russia and sustaining it, was that he had his sort of Saturday night massacre that took a few months, almost 20 years ago, where he replaced all 91 governors and reorganized the whole Russian state into 83 what are called federal subjects and 21 states. And he basically implemented a pretty robust loyalty, approval, almost a corporate structure is really the only way to look at it, where you had these senior vice presidents and assistant vice presidents and senior directors, and those leaders and their apparatus, right? Inside their departments that they have, inside each of those federal subjects and inside the 21 states, really are the levers of power. power and control, like operationally. And so to have a movement that could gain enough momentum and authority, and obviously stay a nonviolent movement to maintain legitimacy is almost impossible at any scale. That doesn't mean it's not happening virtually. So I do think that's a big shift in the modern world, is that your public physical version of that movement can be crushed, but your virtual version can be flourishing and fully developed. And the virtual one existing, whatever, online or in WhatsApp groups, or, people meeting each other, or, playing a video game and everyone saying, if you use the red flower in the game, that equals the support of, our movement or whatever, right? Like those kind of movements, I think, are where these indigenous populations are going to thrive, because that the amount of surveillance that would be required, the Chinese are the only ones that can do that. And the only way they do that is they've eliminated any external technology, and they control the technology. And even they struggle. Remember the whole panda bear thing, and in this game that they play in China. I think the last thing I read is they're up to the 56th type of bear, cuddly bear that they're banning, because each new group of young people figure out a new bear type that they want Xi to represent, and the state has to try to catch up and stop it. So to me, that's this sort of nonviolent online movements, which I think in Russia they have a much greater capability, because the Russian surveillance state at this point just is not that robust at that level.
Yeah.
I do think they're going to spend the time and money to build. They won't be able to build the Chinese version, but they'll build somewhere between where they are now and the Chinese version. And my guess is that they'll use a lot of the Chinese technology to get there, to kind of jumpstart that, over the next
similar that
12 to
Iran
24
has.
months. That's exactly right.
Now, I
yeah.
want to sort of say we're at the 2-hour mark. If you want to speak, please raise your hand and I will unmute you and we can talk about issues. If you have questions, please put those in the chat. I just want to sort of address some of the decolonization themes that we've already sort of discussed a little bit. I think that one of the main comments that we're sort of seeing is this idea that, is this idea that you would have some sort of that we're rejecting the idea that it's possible for Russia to have serious internal autonomy or internal division, or perhaps an external division, right? These areas become independent. It's not about whether or not we like those outcomes or we would prefer those outcomes not occur. It's that we don't believe it likely that those events will occur. And so there's a fundamental difference between probability and desirability. My view, if we're talking about what I think would be desirable, is that Russia becomes more decentralized, that Russia becomes a federation in the true meaning of federation, where you have different localities that have a strong degree of autonomy and independence, similar to the US states, or maybe even more like the Swiss cantons. And therefore, the different aspects of culture can be made manifest in different regions, and you have a reorganization of the various states and principalities that reflect the difference in culture and identity. But that's not the Russia that has any chance of happening in the next 30 to 40 years unless something radically changes. Because the only people, and Greg and Aaron, you can correct me if you feel differently, the only people who are likely to subsume power if Putin loses it are going to be more extremely unitary in their approach to politics than federal in their approach to politics. So that's not going to happen, regardless of whether it might be better in our respective opinions.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And like I said, I think one of the aspects that is it's very underrated is the massive reorganization of state power, right? Because in the 90s, Russia was moving to a more devolving form of federated politics. In basically at 90, I think it was 91. It was 91. Pretty sure 91 or 93, somewhere like that. 91, 2 or 3. I'll look it up. But and you know, I'm not saying all the people who were elected in those positions were phenomenal, but the point is that there was a localization that was really starting to take hold. But that localization obviously ran up into challenging central power, and they weren't challenging central power in sort of big macro ways, right? They weren't saying, oh, hey, Russia shouldn't, be, doing X, Y, or Z with NATO. This was more tactical. This was more practical. This was daily life. This was, how come this road project has this contractor from Moscow and it's all the way out here in Siberia, right? This was all this real world, kind of fight back central, what people would talk about in sort of constitutional government, the federalists and the anti-federalists, right? This was those real debates, which I really do believe were starting to flourish. But it was a real challenge to the regime, because eventually you did get governors who pushed back pretty aggressively on central power in Moscow, especially when it came to things like healthcare budget, education budget. This reapportionment, right? Which in government, that's like a government. This is sort of like everyone goes to sleep, put you to sleep, boring stuff. But how you apportion, electors, how you apportion budgets and structures based on populations, percentage of populations, age groups, censuses around demographics. I mean, this is all this sort of sausage being made behind the scenes that normal people just don't care about or don't even know it's happening anywhere, really. But this is really the mechanism of what you have, right? More often than not, the road and the highway and the train and the airport and all the stuff you have around you, it comes from a version of this over decades, maybe up to half a century or more.
I just wanted to say that this question of federated state federation is discussed in the opposition. So, I mean, it seemed to be unlikely, but if any of the opposition leaders that could be nowadays considered, as far as I know, there are 3, Navalny, obviously, Khodorkovsky, and Kasparov. So these are 3 that could be considered, even though Khodorkovsky said that no, he's not interested in that at all. But because who knows if something happens and Russia suffers some kind of collapse and starts disintegrating, this and the opposition would have any chance, at least right now, those 3 are visible. Maybe there are more, I don't know. But they are talking about federation. It's being discussed among the intellectuals in Russian opposition as a very viable solution to the problem. Obviously, after the war, and
yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear with the size, scope, scale, and enormous gap of development that Russia has, equalized development across the scale of what Russia is, that federated system really is the only pragmatic and long-term practical system. And when I say federated, I mean, they would argue today, if they, if they wanted to, that they're a federated system, but they're a federated system with governors appointed. That's about the least federated system you could have. But where we're talking about real indigenous, state authority, and a equalizing effect coming from the federal authority, which I think most places agree, things that make sense for that. Like when you have your international airport, that tends to be more of a federal thing. When you have your large scale interstate or national wide highways or large sets of infrastructure, communications, things like that, those ones tend to make sense. Your largest universities, anything that requires major intervention at the federal or national level, I think most parties agree that makes sense to keep those things mostly federal or semi-federal, maybe. But when you get to your localized, approaches to, your local version of a technical college or local, highways, small ports, things that are truly domestic and local to that, to that region or that area, or in Russia, the subject, then those need to be, hyper localized so that the indigenous populations have their rights and their, and their objectives that can be met, and that taxes. And I think this is really the heart of the matter in a place as big as Russia, is in essence a new tax model. And that is going to be the most challenging thing, I think, in any of these very large states. One, whether people like it or not, what's one big advantage the United States has is it has localized property taxes, of which 100% of that stays within your state everywhere.
Now, we have AR. AR, you wanted to say something?
Hello, do you have my sound?
Yeah, we hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, first of all, sorry for my English. I try to explain my mean.
Great.
I want to ask you, what's your idea about this same behavior they are between the Russia and another dictatorship groups around it? Because now one day we woke up and we see the Russia forced us without we want. They forced us to the war, and without we want it, by the, I don't know, by the government, by the regime. They played like a colony for Russia. And if you know about the history, we have a very, I respect to all of the Russian, but we have a very deep problematic history with the Russia from the since the Tsarist age till now. And now we are worried. Most of the Iranian, they are worried. Maybe they continue this and they send us to this war. Do you know about the Wagner also? The Wagner, it is like a Hezbollah for Iran or another groups in the Iraq. They are controlled by Iran. And we think in Iran, they are behaviors like each other. We think with us, maybe they force us to the war, directly in the war. What's your idea about it? Thank you.
I don't think Iran will send soldiers to go fight in Ukraine. I do see something like Hezbollah possibly forming. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's a possibility. And when we're talking about Hezbollah, we're talking about the Hezbollah manifestation that exists in Syria and Lebanon, not the Hezbollahi that are on the streets in Iran, which is a very different sort of organization. I think that at the moment, Iran benefits more from sending drones to Russia, because Russia becomes an effective staging ground for them to see what works and what doesn't, especially against American-made weapons. Because if Iran were to ever go to war against Israel, which is a non-zero possibility. Right now, it's currently a proxy war and an indirect conflict, right? Killing of scientists, small terrorist attacks, and what have you, airstrikes. If it ever becomes a physical war, most of Israel's military apparatus is American-made or modified from American-made. So by using the Mujtahid drones and the Shahid drones in Ukraine, Iran basically has a free pass to sort of watch how these things will interact. And that to them, I think, is far more useful than trying to send an expeditionary force. I think the other reason why I have as a possible but low likelihood that they'll form a Hezbollah type organization in occupied Ukraine is simply because you don't have a groundswell of local support. which that can tap into. Most Hezbollah agents in Lebanon are Lebanese. Most Hezbollah agents in Syria are Syrian. The leadership is, of course, from Iran or educated in Iran, but the rank and file are local. I don't see Russians lining up to join a Shiite Islamist organization in much the same way that Hezbollah, despite having a large Greek Orthodox support in Lebanon, doesn't have a lot of Greek Orthodox members. Probably the best template that Iran could use in Ukraine would be the PMF, which is the Popular Mobilization Force in Iraq, which has a lot of ethnic minority representation, right? Some Sunni Arabs, some Assyrian Christians, some Kurds, and so forth. But still, Shiites are the predominant majority, and I just don't see anything parallel to that in the Russian situation. So I don't think Iranians will be conscripted or to fight in Ukraine. And I think that a Hezbollah type organization is relatively low probability. Beyond that, I think that the cooperation that already exists will be deeper and more entrenched than it already has been.
Okay, if you let me, I ask another question. I'm very
Sure.
short. But what is your idea about the Russia when the Russian alarm about the world war? If they think to the world war, they should to have some alliance. And where is their alliance?
Alliance, you mean?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I understand. Are you asking, is Iran an ally of Russia?
No, I want to say, what do you think when the Russia speak about it will be danger of the world war? When they speak about the world war, they tend to start the world war alone. They need some another countries to will be near them, and for that, I think maybe they try to use us.
I think that Russia understands Putin is a rational entity, despite what a lot of people talk about, and I think he understands that even if he mobilizes Iran's military on the borders with whatever states he wants to fight, be it NATO or just containing it to Ukraine, that it's not going to make a fundamental difference if he's trying to escalate this to a world conflict. Iran's military doesn't have a powerful power of projection. It can operate in areas where it has Hezbollah organizations because it has those organizations, but the IRGC is a small entity in and of itself, and the Iranian military, it can't. So I don't think Russia would expect that from Iran in a World War III situation. I don't think Russia's even moving towards a World War III situation.
Yeah, I do think I would say one thing that this conflict with Ukraine is sort of highlighting for Iran. Iran can live in this sort of second-tier partner role in supporting Russia directly, indirectly, by providing additional hardware, especially lower distance-based missile systems and drones. I'm sure lots of communications technology, because they have fairly robust counter surveillance capabilities, et cetera. And that's a safe space that they can operate in and not challenge not just NATO, but more importantly, their more supportive European, they're not partners, but let's say states in Europe that would like to see a new, JOCPA type Iranian deal happen. But the moment the Iranians would step in a much more aggressive manner by providing, let's say longer range missiles, longer range capabilities, and more aggressive action that's more directly attributable to the state, to Iran itself, then they know this, they will lose any of that sort of adjacent support that they have in Europe, which is where they have support, right? The support for a new quote unquote Iran deal is really from Europe, and not all of Europe for that matter, but let's say half of it. But the moment there would be any projection of power directly into this conflict, I think they lose that, and I think it doesn't give them much gain. They've already attained status from the Russian regime as a direct supporter immediately, and providing support of pretty substantial support, right? I would say thousands of drones and missiles, and probably more than that, probably tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces and anti-tank weapons, et cetera, that the Russians need. So, and probably, and my guess is some trainers. I think that's probably the place the Iranians could play at this point. The biggest new role is they could support the Russian cadre. So the Russian cadre, so I mean, this is a thesis I have in this conflict. One of the reasons this is going to be a frozen conflict is that the Russians, through almost all their capable cadre, senior cadre at this conflict in the first 6 months, and got most of them killed or wounded, or basically knocked out of action for a substantial period of time. And the Ukrainians built up and had some cadre that they developed over the course of the last 18 months, and they've lost quite a bit, not maybe as much as the Russians, but quite a bit. So there is this almost battle of depleted cadre, and cadre is fundamental. Cadre are your trainers. They're your non-commissioned officers. They're actually your army. No matter what people really want to say, and that isn't me being biased speaking as the NCO, but I used to not be an NCO, and I know the difference of being a newly trained soldier and one that is a junior non-commissioned officer, and then moves more into a more middle or senior non-commissioned officer role, and what that role is in every force. And the Iranians have capable NCOs. I mean, they really do. They might be very brutal, they might be very Wagner-like, but they are capable. And they've proven as force multipliers for decades in this role in the occupied territories, in Syria and Lebanon. I mean, all over the place, really everywhere. Everywhere they go, that's probably the thing they bring that is as world class as anyone that wants to bring this like this, is they bring this ability to develop forces, especially small, medium, and size, maybe small, large forces, is something underneath a battalion. And if the Russians and the Iranians can cut some deal where the Iranians take on that supportive role, that's going to be a big benefit to the Russians long term. It really will be.
So any last questions or comments before we close this out?
Thank you.
All right. We are history.
I thank you for narrating this, and Greg for your time, and Zach and everybody else. It just started pouring rain here in our region, so we got from the beginning of. Is it pouring where you are, Greg, or not yet?
I actually have sun here in Brooklyn. Yeah.
Oh, it's going to rain in about 10 minutes. So
yeah, exactly. All right. So we are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard. On Wednesdays, I do my Middle Eastern history series, and this upcoming Wednesday, we're going to have one that a lot of Americans, I think, will resonate with. I'm jokingly calling it the American Iraqi history, starting with the Persian Gulf War into the Iraq War of 2003, and moving into the post-Iraq War situation with Islamic State and the Shiite-led democratic government, to the extent that we can call it a democratic government, an independent and quasi-independent Kurdistan. So that will be this upcoming Wednesday. And as I mentioned, the 2 Wednesdays after that are the modern period in Turkey. We also have our Dead Languages series and our Powerful Women series, which are once a month. Aaron and I will probably have a follow-up to this Ukraine situation in a few months or so, and maybe a European Union situation somewhere in there. And of course, we have all of our historic series, and you can find all of those at the links that you see on the screen right here. Our meetup will allow you to see all of our events. Our YouTube will allow us to see all of our past events, because they are all recorded, and they will be up there. And of course, we appreciate any support you can give us. And
one other quick thing, I did put links in here for those of you that are interested, that go into the more details about the Russian federalism and sort of its, at least its beginning stages, and then how it's sort of evolved, or how it's evolving. Because I do think that's one of those slow boil areas that people should pay attention to long term who really want to watch Russia and are interested in its sort of evolution.
Richard, I have a couple more presentation I just want to mention quickly. Is it okay?
Yeah, of course.
Besides Richard's presentation, we do have Asian philosophy. That's usually is every evening on every Saturday. Also, we have a presentation on that's called it's going to be presented by Jane, who does our powerful series presentation, and it's going to be it's called ancient transoceanic contact with the new world. Okay, not particularly ancient, but so when Columbus came to Americas, what was the contact? You know, also prior to that, how the Mayan and Aztecas civilization was developed, and we're going to talk about this very weird mystic figurines, bobbing hats, and then also at the end of the month, do join us for History of Opera, which is on July 30th. As represented by Jonathan's wife, who is a PhD in music. Going to talk about how the opera was developed, how come they use Italian language in opera, and so forth, so on. That's all I wanted to mention. And thank you, everybody. Have the rest. A great presentation, Richard, Aaron, and Greg, and have a nice the rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
All right.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thanks,
Take
Greg.
care.
Great job.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.